All right, welcome everybody. I apologize for not having exciting video lectures this time. I decided to just do a screenshot in the interest of time, and I'm trying to remember a song that might be good for these ones here, and I can't think of one right now, but I'm sure I will come up with one as soon as we finish. So anyway, just to set the stage a little bit for the reading that you are doing this week. David Korten worked just like Bryant Myers was a vice president for World Vision. David Korten was a vice president for an organization called World Neighbors. And World Neighbors, it's a very good organization. It has a very good reputation. Korten worked for many years in Asia, and he wrote a book about 10, 15 years ago now called Getting to the 21st Century. And it was a reflection on development, trends in development, and NGOs. What you are reading for this week is two chapters from the book, Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. What I'm talking about here briefly is describing a little bit from what in Chapter 10, which I consider the more important chapter. So if you have to prioritize, you should prioritize Chapter 10. So what Korten said is that in his many years of experience working with NGOs, he said that all NGOs tended to go through similar phases. He said they almost always start doing certain types of things, and then as they gain more experience in the context, they shift to other types of things. And so he called these shifts, these phases, he called them generations, the NGO generations. So he said the first generation, when let's say an organization just starts, let's say Anastas forms an NGO. He wants to help work on, I don't know, Anastas well-being or Bichiku well-being in Elbasan. What would he likely do first? Well, Korten said that NGOs almost always started with what he called the first generation, a delivery of goods. So the school, there's people lack education. Let's build a school. People need health care. We will build a hospital. People are hungry. We will distribute food. So we'll do food distribution. So there's a strong emphasis on product delivery, what Korten was saying. And to many ways, the NGO worker is an administrator. He's trying to move funds and money from one place to another. So Korten said that this first generation phase was a lot of infrastructure building, wells, schools, hospitals, and a lot of food distribution. World Vision Albania, if you remember the early days, which many of you probably don't, this was one of the first things they did in Albania. They would build schools. They built schools all over the rural areas. They renovated clinics and hospitals. If you talk to community stakeholders doing evaluations, these are still many of the things that they remember from World Vision, was World Vision building things. And World Vision staff was composed of engineers and administrators who were moving the money and the resources. Well, Korten said that after an organization works for a while in a context, it starts to sort of get to a crisis point where it realizes that its product delivery isn't working. In World Vision, what people would say when I would talk to them about this time is they're like, yeah, we built all these schools, and 4 years later we would go back to the areas where we built the schools, and the schools had fallen apart again. Or we gave food to people, and next week they're still hungry. So Korten said that at that point the organization tends to shift into a second generation, and the second generation focused on delivering knowledge, if you want to call it, or trainings. So the idea was, instead of just giving a man a fish in delivery of goods. You teach a man to fish, and then he knows how to keep fishing. He can keep. So they're saying, well, if people are hungry, we shouldn't just give them food. We should also teach them how to grow their own food. So this teaching them really revolved into then a wider range of trainings. So the NGO ends up doing lots and lots of trainings in the second generation. The typical NGO worker then becomes a trainer. Now, Korten said that these first two generations primarily rely on what he called an assistential approach. What you mean by that is that that the solution to the issue comes from outside the context, whether it's bringing in building materials to build schools or whether it's bringing in knowledge to do trainings. The solution is the social service organization. The NGO is bringing the solution from the outside to the context. Well, after a while, Korten said that NGOs run up against some of the limitations of trainings. In the case of teach a man to fish, the question then becomes, who owns the lake? So then they said that when NGOs start asking those questions, they move into what he called a third generation type of approach. And this is a fairly radical shift. To go the second generation to the third generation is fairly extreme, because the third generation focuses on facilitation. And it's really doing reflection and analysis of people's realities. So if you had the question of teaching a man to fish, up here the NGO worker would be facilitating community reflection and analysis about who owned the lake, who had access to the lake. Why is that the way it is? And the worker then becomes more of a catalyst, asking questions to get people to think about their own solutions. And what Korten said is that this kind of approach is more of a facilitative approach. It assumes that the solutions are coming from inside the context, and what you have to do is shift the way that people are looking at the issue. So the assistential says the solution comes from outside, and the worker is bringing in either products or knowledge, and the facilitative approach says that the solution really has to come from within the community, and it's really around reflection and analysis. Now, the fourth generation, he said then, is when people start to realize that a lot of the problems aren't at the level of the community. Things that are affecting the community may actually have their source somewhere far away, that are affecting multiple communities. So, for example, a corrupt government might be reducing the amount of money that is available to local communities for infrastructure. Well, the way to deal with a corrupt government, you can't just organize a community group. The corrupt government at the national level needs a national level force. And so Korten said that once NGOs start thinking about these sort of forces that are affecting communities, but which lie away from the community, such as a corrupt government, said the fourth generation that NGOs move into is working with forming social movements, so that banding community groups together from a whole variety of different communities to form sort of a national level structure to demand their rights, as it were. The focus becomes on establishing networks between groups, and the role of the NGO worker becomes more of a connector and a catalyst. So the solutions again come from within, but not from within the community, but from within the nations, the various communities that are all scattered around the nation. So Korten said that over time you would see an NGO start to shift its programming, moving over this sort of expanse. Now, for many of you, you're probably already thinking about World Vision, and I'm going to give you a hint just to see if this shows up in anybody's papers. But World Vision has, used to be in Albania very heavy on building schools. Then they shifted to becoming, right now they're very heavy on trainings. We do trainings for this, that, and the other thing. Awareness raising, hygiene, health, blah, 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 all sorts of trainings, just gobs and gobs of trainings. So I would say that the traditional current World Vision practice in Albania is around this second generation. The new DPA and all of the resistance it's gotten, the development programming approach, IPM, IPM and the development programming approach is really trying to shift World Vision programming into this third and fourth generation. Well, let's probably trying to just get to the third generation for the moment. And it's not surprising that there's a lot of resistance to the DPA and IPM, because if you look at the transitions, this is essentially moving World Vision from being an assistential organization to being a facilitative organization. And there's a lot of contradictions. There's still a lot of sponsorship programming. Sponsorship as a project is very much a first generation yet. A lot of our ADP activities are kind of second generation, but there are sort of things that the Global Center and Regional Office are asking us to do that are starting to look like third generation, and even to some extent fourth generation. So there's a mixture of these different generations that you can see happening right now in World Vision, which was actually what your reading assignment was. I mean, your writing assignment. So, essay questions. That was just to summarize quickly the generations, just chapter 10. But I still would encourage you to read the chapter, obviously. Now, the essay questions, the first one relates to chapter 9. And as I said, you only have to write about this one that I've highlighted. You don't have to write about all of these little bullet points down here. These are just for you to check your knowledge, but this is the one that I want you to write about. So for chapter 9, Korten is writing about what is the role of NGOs in society. What role do they play? And so I said, pretend you are a government, let's say Albania's government, asking World Vision, what use are you? What role do you play on our society? So based on what Korten would said in chapter 9, how would you respond? Now, I do not want you to use standard World Vision language about how we do child well-being, blah, blah, blah. What I want is for you to use the language of the chapter to re-describe what an organization like World Vision, what its role would be in society. So I said about 600 words, more or less, sort of how you would respond to the Albanian government. Now, the more important summary question, hint, hint, is chapter 10, which is around this generations of NGOs and programming. So I want you, since I gave away some of this here, but I said most NGOs do not actually fit neatly into one or another category. They will actually do things, they will actually be trying to do many different things at the same time. And sometimes a lot of the tensions in the organization come when, let's say, there's a lot of people who made their living doing the first generation type of work, building schools. They're not too excited about this new idea of training, or the training people are not too excited about this new idea of facilitation. So sometimes the tensions occur not just about the different paradigms, but also about the different types of generations. So what I want you to do is think about looking at World Vision Albania. What are two activities or processes that you can identify for each of these four generations? So what are two things that you've seen in a World Vision Albania that would be first generation? What are two things that you would see that are second generation? Be specific. I mean, don't just say trainings, right? But although I kind of gave that away. Okay, these ones are harder. What are what are two things you might find that are kind of this facilitation, reflection, analysis, the third generation? And what are two things that you might find that are more the fourth generation? I'm going to warn you that some of these will be easier than others to identify. So that's what one of the analyses I want you to do. I don't just want you to describe. I want you to also to analyze. What things were easy to find, what generations were hard to find, what kinds of trends and patterns, what shifts do you see compared to 5 years ago? If you were here that long, what differences do you see in the way that World Vision is working? So that I want you to sort of reflect on what you are seeing in World Vision. This will come in handy during the group presentation as well. But these are the 2 essay questions that I want you to look at this week. All right, I think I've gone on long enough on that, so I will finish.